So this is Intro to Kinesiology, Anatomy and Physiology, Part 2. And in this section, we're going to look at the nervous system, and we're going to look at the nervous system, the respiratory system, and the cardiovascular system. So we'll start with the nervous system, and we're going to introduce this concept of the neuron, which is the cell of the nervous system. And all parts of the nervous system, whether you're talking about the brain, the spinal cord, or the nerves, all the cellular components are the same. Now, they differ a little bit in structure, but they're a neuron. Purpose of the nervous system is to look at communication, so looking at signaling coming from the brain out to the environment, and then the sensory aspect from the environment coming into the brain. And then we'll talk about the different divisions of the nervous system. And again, I want to reiterate that this is meant to be just a global, really light introduction to the anatomical components to give you a taste or a sampling of what the future holds. So when we look at the nervous system, this is a signaling component. This is looking at information that's coming from the environment in, and that's sensory, and it's also coming from the brain or drive or desire out in terms of action to manipulate or work within the environment. So every thought, every emotion, every action, every sense is all communicated via the nervous system. And what's really fascinating is that the nervous system communicates like a computer. Computer language is considered binary, so it's either on or off, switches of zeros and ones, and that's basically how nerves contract. They can only send a signal, and it's either an on signal or an off signal, so a yes, no, green, red, X, O, 0, 1, and everything that you experience, so everything you've tasted, everything you see, everything you smell, all the variety of things that we can experience in life are all communicated via zeros and ones. On the blackboard shell, I have a video that was a Super Bowl ad from Turkish Airlines, and it kind of shows you, or at least within 2 minutes, I think it does a very good job of explaining the wide range of experiences we as humans have potential for. There's also another video there that is more of a humorous video. It's from The Matrix, and I'm surprised at the amount of people that have not seen The Matrix. But if you haven't seen The Matrix, watch The Matrix, and watch this one part, and it talks about how we as humans have been coded into computer simulation, and how things that are we all experience things differently, but yet we all experience things the same. And so what things we like, things we dislike, but it's interesting because some people experience things different than others. Some people are super tasters, super sensors, super hearers, and it all has to do with the sensitivity that they have to those nerve aspect. So that's it with the sensory component. But now all these senses, all these thoughts, all these emotions, all these actions, they all are conducted down this cellular structure called the neuron. And that's this right here. You have a cell body, and you have a tail, and you have these fatty nodes that are myelin sheaths. And it's basically excitable tissue, and it can conduct a signal. It's basically taking a chemical signal, converting it into electricity, and then converting it into chemical, and then it's just kind of a domino effect from the brain all the way to the effector, and then from the sensor all the way back to the brain. So these are the dendrites, the axon. So here's your cell structure, right? And this is the typical axon. Like I said, it varies in terms of shape, but the basic structures exist within that. Now, within the nervous system, you have sensory information, or information that's coming from the environment through an afferent neuron that's coming into the body, and then from the body, the spinal cord up to the brain, and then you have, let's say you need an action for that, or it starts at the brain, it's coming down the spinal cord through the efferent neuron and then out to the muscle fiber. The muscles are our ability to interact with our environment. And then you have these interneurons that are acting as like relay stations within the spinal cord. But you basically have these one-way lanes, if you will, highway of information. You have dedicated sensory information coming from the environment, and you have dedicated motor information coming out to the environment. Now, when you look at nerve function, there's a certain threshold for these things to be activated. And we sometimes do experiments in class where we can see like sensitivity. The best example that I can share is that if you get someone that's really ticklish, and you kind of ramp up the environment, and you let them know you're going to tickle them, and you can get to the point where you can get your fingers really close to them and actually touch them, and they'll start giggling and laughing hysterically as they're being tickled, but it has nothing to do because you didn't touch them, right? they ramped up their sensitivity to it. Basically what they did is they lowered their threshold of activation. It also happens too when you really aren't in that good of a mood and someone says something stupid and you're like, whatever. But you can also be in a room and there can be something that's really not that funny, but everyone's cracking up and laughing, and then everything becomes funny. You drop something on the floor and it's because your threshold of activation. So there's these really cool things within the body where you can sensitize or desensitize your tolerance to aspects, to different components. We experience this every single day. Right now it's the middle of summer, or it could be middle of winter. Just think in coming out of summer, let's say it's coming out of winter, and 20, 30, 40 degree days, and you get your first like 60 degree weather in Chicagoland. I would guarantee most people are out without a jacket, and most people are probably in shorts, right? You come at the tail end of summer, so after August, October, and you get your first 60 degree day, and you're going to see the Canadian Goose jackets and Ugg boots, or because our sensitivity, our tolerance, our threshold, what we perceive as cold or heat, has been acclimatized or changed. So this happens for all of that whole list of things that I showed, with like movements, sensory, emotions, everything. You can have things ramped up or ramped down. When you work out, do you listen to smooth jazz elevator music? No, you're listening to something that's really upbeat and something that's really aggressive, because you're trying to ramp up that emotional component. So this threshold of activation, your body can kind of buffer and a little bit and modulate how things are thing. The reason why there's a toilet there is that once though that threshold's active, that's it. You can't control it. There's no taking back. So once that nerve, once that sensor is activated, that signal is going to run its course. It's going to send the signal back to the brain, and then it's going to rebalance and re-threshold. So there's that period of, once you flush that toilet, you have to wait a full 30, 40 seconds until that you're able to flush that again. These signals are going down this tail of the neuron, and it's covered in this thing called myelin, and this is the myelin sheath. And basically what it is, it's the warp drive. So when a signal comes here, it's basically slungshot down this thing, because these are insulated components. And when myelin starts to deteriorate or go away, like for diseases called like MS, you lose the ability for that effective, efficient communication. Now remember, you touch something hot on the stove, it's got to travel the 2 or 3 feet, maybe 2 feet to get from your fingertip to your spinal cord, another maybe 6 or 8 inches to the brain, and then the brain has to travel back down 6 or 7 inches to the motor neuron, and another 2 feet. So think about how fast it has to happen before tissue damage sets in. So all these things are happening in milliseconds, hundredths of a second, in terms of communication. So the brain is, or the nervous system is divided into 2 main divisions. You have the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, part of the axial skeleton, if you want to think of it that way. Then you have the peripheral nervous system, which is going out to the arms and legs. So it's everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. These are further subdivided into different components, but we'll just keep it here for now. The brain has multiple components. For PT school, you'll take anatomy and physiology, and then you'll take a whole separate section of neuroanatomy, looking at the brain itself and part of the spinal cord. There are areas of the brains that we still aren't clear what they do. So you hear these sci-fi movies where they talk about people that can control things with their brain and whatever, but they say we only use 20% of our brain. And that's not true. We actually use all of our brain. It's just that we don't know what the other 40, 50, 60% does, right? There's still things that are being discovered, and they're like, oh yeah, we just figured this out. But you have these different lobes, different divisions. You have the cortex, you have the cerebral cortex and cerebellum, then you have the brainstem. There's quite a bit of structure. And again, not to memorize all this, but just, again, a listing to kind of show you where different things happen. So your primal brain looks at like arousal, life support, reflexes is in the brainstem. Your cerebellum is balance and muscle tone, and different aspects for like your thalamus is involved in memory and so forth. So you can kind of take a look through that. But again, it's just meant to show that the complexity of the brain is not just, hey, this is the left side of the brain is involved in language, right side of the brain is math and whatever. So the brain is the command center, and then the spinal cord is the highway of transfer. And you have 4 main divisions, but 3 curves of the spine: the cervical region, thoracic, lumbar, and the sacral region. And the spinal cord is a collection of, it's basically a highway that has descending and ascending, so inbound, outbound information. And it's pretty relative to the area. So your cervical spine is going to have more of the arm and shoulder movements. Thoracic spine is going to have trunk movements. And the lumbosacral region is going to have more leg movements. So those are the nerves dedicated to those regions. And that's why with spinal cord injuries, the lower the level of the spinal cord, the lower the dysfunction. So spinal cord injury to, let's say, L4, L5, you'll still have full function, everything above it, but you'll lose most function below. Cervical injury way up high here, you're only going to have maybe facial and throat muscle control, and you're going to lose function, everything down. And you kind of see that depicted here with these things called dermatomes. And so each region is controlled both by motor output and input sensory. So if you look at here and you touch someone like right on their collarbone here and they can't feel it, there's probably something going on with the sensory nerve way of C2. Or if someone has weakness in their leg and they're walking and their foot's dragging on the ground, there might be a motor issue with like L4, L5, right? So you can kind of map these things through the body. There's overlap and not everyone's the same, but for the majority of the population, they kind of follow this component. There's two functional divisions within the nervous system. There's the somatic or the motor muscle system. This is the voluntary control of skeletal muscles. So this would be the exit or output. And then we have the autonomic nervous system, which is the involuntary, the subconscious. This is body regulation and digestion. You'll look down here and you'll see this term sympathetic, the sympathetic nervous system. And I'm sure you're familiar with that before. This is considered the fight or flight system. And then its antithesis, its opposite, its yin and the yang, the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the rest and repair. And so we're either in a sympathetic state where we're stressed and we are fighting for our lives, or we're in a parasympathetic state where we're recovering and regenerating and growing. And so life is really a balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. And we live in a time in a society where the stresses that we're exposed to aren't just the environmental stresses that nature has for us, but also psychological stresses, emotional stresses, even chemical stresses. So caffeine, nicotine, different components that rev up our system to create alertness and awareness. These are all sympathetic stimulation. And it's not so much that one is good or bad, but you want to have an equal balance. One step back, one step forward, one step back, or two steps forward, right? And we live in a sympathetic dominant society. And so we're trying to figure out ways to engage or stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. And when you look at a lot of the Eastern aspects, some of the newer medicines or the newer fitness paradigms, it's not just like this go hard, go home, or no pain, no gain component. It's this equal stimulation followed by appropriate recovery. So appropriate within capacity stimulation, not too much, not too little, like Goldilocks principle, and this recovery. So I have another video on the Blackboard shell that introduces Wim Hof. And if you're not familiar with Wim Hof, he's a fascinating individual. And what's unique about him is it's not just him. He has figured out a way to teach people how to do this. So it's not a genetic thing. It's a physiological component. And he uses breathing, mindset, and basically that sensitization aspect that we talked about earlier to increase your tolerance capacity for sympathetic stress so that it doesn't burn you out, right? So I would watch that video and feel free to do your own research and dig deeper. Great guy. If you have access to Netflix on Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop Lab, he takes a whole group of frail, prissy California, live in luxury, takes them out in the middle of the woods and drops them in a lake at 32 degrees, and they all survive and they love it, right? So it's pretty fascinating. So definitely take a look at that. Okay, the last two systems are the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. So the cardiovascular system is basically the heart and all the blood vessels. And what you see depicted here is the heart is basically four chambers, two pumps. One that's dedicated to pumping blood to the lungs so it can pick up oxygen. That oxygen comes back to the heart, and then the heart then pumps it to the rest of the body so it can exchange oxygen for carbon dioxide and basically make that change. So it's two closed circuits, pulmonary going to the lungs, systemic going to the body, and it's basically a gas exchange for getting O2 to the cells and getting carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The heart is one muscle that's kind of wrapped together, and with that one muscle wrapped together, it's able to create 4 functional chambers. And you have this left side of the heart that's dedicated, the right side of the heart that's dedicated to sending deoxygenated blood, so blood that's rich in carbon dioxide and waste product, to the lungs to pick up oxygen and get rid of its carbon dioxide. And then you have the systemic system, or the systemic part, that's receiving blood from the lungs and then down here and then to the rest of the body. You have arteries that carry blood away from the heart. You have veins that carry blood to or towards the heart. And the heart, as a muscle, has electrical conductive system, so it's done by electricity. Things start here at this SA node. The signal comes down, and it creates these atria to contract, and then the ventricle next, and it's all sequenced and timed perfectly so that these flaps are closing and the blood has a one-way flow through that. When you have issues with the electrical system, that's when you end up with like VTAC and cardiac arrest and so forth. So it's very important that this stays regulated. Now, that's probably the next video I'll post, but I'm sure people would get offended by it. That if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, there's a scene where one of the priests are sacrificing a human, and he reaches into the heart and pulls the chest out, pulls the heart out, reaches in the chest and pulls the heart out, and the heart is still beating. And this is true. A heart will continue to beat on its own because it has its own internal pacemaker set at that SA node. And really how the heart changes its rate is by that sensitization or desensitization, by either sympathetic or parasympathetic inputs, by either increasing heart rate or decreasing heart rate. So the normal heart rate is between 60 to 100. That's your pulse. It's expected to be between 70 and 80. And you have this thing called stroke volume and cardiac output, which you'll read through. Again, just be exposed to it. Don't worry about going into any detail for this particular class. And the last system is the respiratory system. This is looking at ventilation, so getting oxygen in and getting CO2 out. This gas exchange is totally passive. It's happening automatically because of the gradient flows between the tissues. And here's your conducting system where the air is going in through the nose, mouth, down to the lungs. And this is where the gas exchange is actually happening down here in the bronchioles, actually in the alveoli. Breathing, if we just take a second here and if you just just pay attention to your breathing right now, 90% of your breathing for 90% of you should be coming just from your belly, right? So if you look down, if you're sitting, and you take a breath in, take a breath out, just normal, quiet breathing, you should see your belly kind of push out on the way in, and the belly comes back in on the way out. Now what I want you to do is I want you to take a really deep breath, really, really deep breath. And then get some more air in there. And what you should notice now is not just your belly sticking out, but your whole chest cavity, your whole chest rib cage expanded, right? And this breathing, if you watch that Wim Hof video, this short, shallow, this diaphragm breathing, this is the relaxed breathing, right? During periods of stress, or during periods of any kind of stress, right? Stress is neither good or bad. It's just any kind of physical, emotional, psychological. Your body has a more demand for resources. And it's preparing to ramp up metabolic output. And so what's going to happen is the amount of oxygen going to the tissues is going to increase, or it's going to need to increase. And so what happens is your body starts to go from a quiet breathing, which is abdominal breathing, to more of this chest breathing. At rest, if someone is chest breathing, there is some level of stress going on, either physical, mental, emotional, or there's some structural damage within the tissue, right? There's some issue that needs to be addressed. What's really fascinating is during periods of stress, you do more of this short, shallow breathing. And then when at rest, at sleep or relaxation, you're taking more of these long, slow, deep breaths. And what's really fascinating is the whole physiology of breathing is the only system, well, second system, but main system of the body that is both voluntary and involuntary. You can voluntarily control your breath, but if you don't want to think about breathing, you don't have to, right? But if you're an athlete or a performer, like a singer or giving a speech, you can control your breath. Deep sea diver or any kind of swimmer, control your breath. Walking through a pume of smoke, someone's cutting concrete on the sidewalk, and you want to hold your breath, you have the option of doing so. You fall asleep at night, you don't have to worry about breathing because it's going to happen automatically. So what's really fascinating is that breathing is a doorway to the parasympathetic nervous system. And so it's the primary component where, like meditation and martial arts and yoga and even Wim Hof, breathing is a tool to engage different aspects of that. It's easy to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. It's very hard to find aspects of parasympathetic, and breathing is one of the ways. So it's a fascinating component with the breathing, the breath. If we were to hook up a pulse oximeter where we measure your heart rate, it would just take you maybe 2 or 3 really deep breaths of just breathing in and then slowly breathing out, and you would see not just a minimal, but like a heart rate drop from, like, say you're at 85 down to like 71. And you can train that with the biofeedback, and you can continue to control your parasympathetic component to the point where you can kind of train the body to increase its threshold, if you will, its tolerance for activation. So you become more resilient to stress. And that's basically how Wim Hof does his method, is through the breath work, right? Through the breathing. So interesting aspect. Again, outside the scope of the class, but food for thought, maybe plant the seed, some things to research there. So that's it for the anatomy component of both Anatomy 1 and Anatomy 2. Again, just quick overviews. These 2 lectures, I think, are like 20 minutes each, 40 minutes, and that's just listening to the lectures more than enough. Again, it's supposed to be an introduction to what you're going to be exposed to in the future for anatomy.